Good morning. Another sunny day today. Looking forward to today. It'll be good. First of all, wow, where we've got people from all over. And I've got to give a special shout out to, I think it's Carrie, who's mentioned the concrete cows of Milton Keynes a few times over the last few sessions. One of the first things I saw in Milton Keynes was the concrete cows. They were painted pink at the time. So today's session, fantastic session. We've got a brilliant, inspirational Tom Sherrington live with us today. He's put together an insight into Rosenshine's principles and how they can be used for curriculum implementation. So from that point of view, that's what we're going to be looking at today. Fascinating topic, especially with all the other things that we've covered to do with the three I's, to do with impact, implementation within the curriculum regarding the new framework, but lots of other things to unpack and discuss as well. For those of you that have joined us before, thank you for joining us again. Really value your support. Today, we have Tom Sherrington, who will be looking at Rosenshine's principles. This is what he's put together for you today.
Well, welcome everybody to this webinar session about Rosenshine's principles and how they support curriculum implementation. I'll go through the slides and there'll be an opportunity to deal with some questions afterwards. The first thing to say is that I think it's important that people have read Rosenshine's principles, the origin, and to go to a paper like this version of it and read it, and to be encouraged by the fact that Rosenshine is combining ideas from cognitive science, so ideas to do with memory and schema building and the power of retrieval practice and so on, with observational studies which look at what effective teachers typically do in the classroom. And it's the fact that he says there's no conflict at all between these types of studies that gives us confidence that these 10 principles are generally sensible. So they're a good platform for reflecting on your practice in lots of different ways. It's just one list, but it's a good list. It does help with curriculum implementation, because once you've designed all the things you want to teach, you have to get the students to learn them, and so they go hand in hand. And I'm going to basically go through quite a quick run through of some of the ways that I think they overlap. Always I'm thinking about the model to do with schema building in this diagram, which I think is a good basis for a staff discussion in itself. So thinking about how activities that you set up lead to learning, and the idea that each child or each student that you teach has got a schema of their own for any set of ideas, and that you can't see that. But what they're trying to do is build on that, enrich it, deepen it, widen it. So they need to be bringing things back into their working memory, gaining new insights, or new stimulus from the outside, and then reworking that schema so that it makes more sense, or adding things, and then reconsolidating that back into their long-term memory. And the more often we go through that loop, we develop ideas of understanding, fluency, and so on. If we don't think in those terms, there's a risk that we just do things in the short term, which then get forgotten very quickly because we haven't concretely linked it to prior knowledge, and we haven't dealt with the idea of practice and so on. So this is where the kind of the thinking about what you want to teach and the way it's sequenced and then how it's engaged with all come together. So it's worth having a pause and thinking about that model and thinking, how does it work? Do I understand the terms? Do we agree on the terms? And I really recommend having a good shared language around notions like schema building across a group of professionals in the same team. It's this idea of knowledge building on knowledge. So you can't really understand anything or do anything unless it makes sense in relation to things you already know from your kind of experience or your prior knowledge. Knowledge is cumulative in that sense, always adding. And if we're teaching a group of people, we start to sort of, just for pure pragmatism, start assuming they know things that we're then relating to. And that's great if that knowledge is secure, but it's problematic if we're assuming knowledge is there which isn't there. So a big part of teaching is obviously constantly checking, and we can't really just sort of set up a path of curriculum which says we'll go from A to B to C to D and it's all straight, and so we just have to teach it in that sequence and everyone will learn everything. Because what happens is that people will learn different elements to a different degree of success or depth. And so you have to revisit and review all the time in order for all students to be able to form schema which are secure. So curriculum thinking has to have this sense of cumulative knowledge, not just sequential some elements as if they don't connect. And that's true for nearly everything that you teach. Looking back to move forward, checking that people that know those basic ideas. And you have this idea of maturation as well. As we get older, we look back on the things that we learnt at a more immature stage in our learning, and we realise that we now understand those same ideas in a more deep way, and that's really, really important to have opportunities for that to happen. So schema building, I'd say, is one of the most important ideas that teachers need to have in thinking about curriculum thinking, because it gets you away from this sort of just very sort of linear mode of thinking about teaching things in a certain order at a certain rate. You have to respond to the students that you've got and think about what they already know. So you have to have ways of finding out what they already know. It also is important to have ideas to do with, ways in which we can learn more effectively. And something like this, which supports Rosenshine's principles totally, is from the learning scientists. Their ideas about forms of effective learning. So the fact of practicing, remembering, retrieval practice is much more useful than just rereading all the time. The difference between space practice, interleaving, the need for concrete examples. So all of these things are to go away and think about as well, alongside Rosenshine's principles. I'm not going to go into all of them now, but the point I'm making here is that a number of different other sources relating to cognitive science and the science of learning support your thinking about curriculum design as well. So here's an example of schema building to kind of bring this off the page a little bit. If we have a unit of work around, say, the Tudors and Henry VIII's wives as part of that story, and we know some things about them, you need to think about how the students are going to engage with that knowledge and what you want them to know. The way you might, by stimulate prior learning, is by just giving a stimulus like this and getting students to think about what they already know about Henry VIII's wives. You might, at some basic level, want them to know their names. But if you just have this ambition that all we want them to know is their names, it can be very shallow. So, you could look at those names, and if you've never seen them before, they're just odd names. And trying to remember them off by heart is quite difficult, because what are you connecting it to? Not very much. And you might present those names, get students to talk about them, and then take them away again. And the students still don't, can you remember them now just by having seen them there or even said them aloud? And so some of the shallow approaches to teaching can be almost like this, sort of just simple disconnected facts which have no richness, and they're much harder to learn. So of course we have to think that that isn't the goal. The goal of the knowledge here is much richer, and you might have a much more expansive, well, you're going to, aren't you, if you teach this, a much more expansive vision for the purpose of teaching Henry VIII's wives, where it fits into a wider scheme. And here's just a summary of some of the things that you might be including in your curriculum. So this isn't even the curriculum, it's just a sketch of some of the details of the elements of the facts about Henry VIII's wives. And by pitching high and thinking about what the students will know in detail and really working that through, what do I want them to know exactly, you can then start holding students to account for yourself, but also they can themselves about what am I supposed to know. Do I know all these things about Henry VIII's wives? Could I put those things onto a timeline? Could I tell you the story? And you start getting into things like narrative structures. How do I introduce that information? Well, I certainly don't do it by just giving them a table. I actually will make it interesting. I will tell them the story. Maybe we'll read the story and what happened to Anne Boleyn and the extraordinary thing of her being beheaded. The whole issue about the change from being a Catholic country to becoming on the road to becoming the Church of England, and being a Protestant nation, and the whole thing around the divorce of Catherine of Aragon, and etc. etc. The narrative is the start, and then some source material to support that, and then you have a reminder of that in a form like this, and then you can get into the retrieval practice things of, right, well, tell me the story of what happened to Anne Boleyn, and her name is just a tiny, easy to remember thing because we know about Anne Boleyn. She's a real vivid person. So we have to think about curriculum in deep terms so that we can secure the knowledge. But the knowledge does help. These things go together. How can I tell the story of Anne Boleyn if I don't know any facts about her? Well, I can't. So I do need to know some facts. They do matter, because if I don't know the facts, I can't tell the story. And so these things are not separate, but we do have to have this sort of expansive view to begin with, the big picture. What do I want them to know? And there might be details on there I think, I don't need to know that Anne Boleyn came from Norfolk. That's not important. So I need to filter that out. For these students at this age, that's an irrelevant piece of information which is not going to help them. So you filter stuff out that they don't necessarily need at the point of understanding, and so on. And then visualizations like this, can I make a timeline? Can I make a representation which helps them visualize the time order and the length of time that people were connected to Henry, or whatever the significance of that is. But timelines and other sort of visualizations of information help with this schema building by relating the different things together. Another example could be something like this. So if we're talking about science, metal plus acid reacts to make salt plus hydrogen. And I know some science teachers will be having a fit because I didn't put that in. And also it shouldn't say zinc, it should say just Zn there, but that's just, an error. But those two things are different ways of telling a story which has a sort of narrative element to it, and understanding that there's a pattern needs you to show multiple examples. So just to understand that it's always true that when you react a metal with an acid, you get something called a salt, and the gas they make is hydrogen. You'd have to show that lots of examples of that always work. And then what's going on? Well, maybe we have to conceive of that in terms of this model, a conceptual model of atomic conservation, so that we've got the same elements to begin with afterwards, just rearranged. And so when we have a chemical reaction, we're looking for that pattern and we're verifying if that's true. There's one zinc here, so there's one here. There's two hydrogens here, so there's two there, and that sort of thing. The visual, the general rule, the specific example, this is all part of a schema building process. And then you might do a practical to show that that's happened and the students have a vivid real experience. So all this is part of what you need to be thinking about when you're designing a curriculum, is how the schema will be formed for the students to understand what is going on when metals react with acids. And it all forms, some students would understand that better by thinking about the diagram. Some will find the symbolic equation easiest to understand, and they'll be different. So you need to attack the same knowledge in different ways so that students can form schema in a way which makes sense to them in relation to what they already knew before. And then we can go deeper. So, the type of bonding that goes on builds on that. It's really hard to understand bonding if you don't actually have quite a deep understanding of the particle behaviours and so on. And if you're banging on symbols and talking about Zn and Cl, and the students don't really know what those are just by looking at them, you're building on shallow knowledge. So you've got to make sure that everything that you want the students to know to understand your next level of explanation is there, and check and reteach it if you have to. So, what Rosenshine's principles, where does this come into all of that? So far I haven't really mentioned them too much, but it's to do with, he says this, and he says, effective teachers understand how to sequence concepts, build models, provide scaffolds for difficult tasks. And this is all essentially what you're doing when you are sequencing your curriculum. In maths, for example, you'll break down simple operations like this into the steps, understanding how you form fractions with a common denominator, because then we can combine them together. But that in itself requires an understanding of equivalent fractions. Equivalent fractions is where you begin, and some teachers will think, well, they should have done that at primary school, so I don't teach that. But then you'll find that students don't have a secure schema for equivalent fractions, so you do have to teach it again. And you should anticipate that. You can't just go into saying, well, at secondary school, we're going to start with adding fractions. They know fractions, we're just going to do adding fractions, because you have to check that is part of their knowledge. And you'll find that some students still can't do it because it's not that obvious to them. So whenever you're teaching a bit of the curriculum, make a list of what you're assuming the students should know, and then check they do know it. And be prepared to reteach those things. And you have to be prepared to reteach them, otherwise you're going to leave kids behind all the time. And I could go into that in more detail, that specific example. That's just one part of it. It's just that every part of maths has multiple steps, and you need to know what they all are. You need to know how to make connections between things the students already know with, say, algebra. Algebra can be monstrously abstract, and the students lose sense of what brackets mean. They don't really know what they mean, because it's a very abstract idea. So what does it mean? It means we're sort of collecting things together that we then can do the same thing with, and having a tangible thing like, the unknown sweets in a jar, we're just going to call it A, because we can call it whatever we like. We add 4 to it, and then we have 3 lots of the jar and the extra 4. So we've got, we're trying to make something abstract have a concrete home, something the students can relate to that then they can build on. And that type of explanatory model building is really, really important. Having some key ideas that you thread through. So part of your sequencing concepts is about ideas which relate to everything you teach. And in science, these are some of the examples. Every subject has its list, a very short list of things that you use nearly all the time. And it's important to have those. So then you can really focus on those. And once the students understand particles, energy, cells, and the difference between chemical and physical change, well, that explains a lot of science. So it's important to know what you're sort of punching away at regularly all the way through. Things like this, the experience of playing with ice, water and steam as a macro physical object that you can see and handle and touch, and then a model for explaining those things and concretely making that link. This is what schema building is about. So if you're not thinking about that at the level of conceptual understanding, you get students who, will say the words, but they don't really have a model that they're referring to. And you've got to check the students can understand things, and that's where the checking for understanding that Rosenshine talks about comes in all the time. Can they explain it themselves? And, endless science examples of this, where here's another set of ideas represented in lots of ways. You've got words, you've got a visualization, you've got the practical experience, the symbolic equation, and the particles underneath. All of those things add together to understand, and it's the order in which you do them. If you do the practical work first, without knowing any of the symbolic stuff, the students don't really know what they're doing. They're in a lesson heating up some green stuff and making some black stuff, and that's what they'll remember because that's all they could understand at that point. And it doesn't really teach them very much, except that you burn your fingers on the tripod. If you pack it away too soon or whatever, it's not teaching them the conceptual understanding. So when you're doing this equation, which is a reaction called thermal decomposition, to make any sense of what you're seeing, you need to have studied it first in theory, so that what you're seeing has some hope of contributing to your understanding. So we need to make sure that science doesn't seem like a set of magic tricks. It's a set of things which we can explain, and sometimes you need to work out very clearly that the theory needs to come in front of the practical experience. But then there are the opposite. There are things where it's perfectly legitimate and how important to give students hands-on experiences, like, say, making a motor and playing with magnets and seeing what happens when you do things, just without any formalisation, really, just getting the sense of the fact that the motors have certain behaviours, and we can talk about words like rotation and the strength of the field, knowing that later we're going to formalise that with equations and explain everything in a much more formal way with maths and calculations and everything. But it's no good just banging straight into this and assuming the students will pretty much know what you mean by the strength of a magnetic field. Well, maybe they don't really, because they haven't really had any experience of, it's very clear when the further magnets are apart, the weaker the field becomes, or, this idea of the relative directions of things. But what if you've had this experience to build on, then that will make more sense. So your curriculum sequencing has a sort of schema building element at this level. We'll do the motor building in year 8 because that's just a great experience for everybody. And if you're doing the equation in physics in year 10 or 11, then we've got a common experience to build on, and that's a good bit of planning with quite a lot of space in between. And then another science example is something like this: the depth. So how far do we go in explaining things? There's the year 2 example of this. Kids explaining why they're out of breath after running around the playground. That's perfectly normal. But if you're in year 11, it's a totally different level of explanation. So clearly one of the things we're modelling and scaffolding is the depth of response. And that's one of the things you need to think hard about. So this topic comes round and round again, spiralling through your curriculum. You can't just say, oh yeah, we've done the circulatory system. We've done energy and respiration. Because there's always another level of depth. You have to say, well, we'll do it to this level here. We'll come back to it here deeper. And we'll come back to that even deeper still. And that's a good bit of curriculum thinking. You can never really tick that off as learnt, I can explain. It's never as simple as that. So, nearly every scheme of work, what is the prior knowledge that you're assuming? Make a list, write it on the top of the box. This is what we're kind of hoping they know already. They know what a Catholic is and what a Protestant is. Boom, that's something we know, because then we can start talking about the Catholic Church, as an entity. What does that actually mean? What do we mean by economic growth? What's the significance of Nigeria? We're assuming they already know about colonialism and empire and so on. That's the background for this discussion. Well, maybe they don't know about that, so we better make sure they do, and so on and so on. Writing is a classic example of schema building because it's a cumulative thing, constantly changing all the time, and yet you have to sort of teach elements. So you have to break down the things you can teach at any given point, and then constantly allow students to mature and develop, adding more and more to something which is building. So we need to have things like rubrics, things which they can sort of mentally tick off, things that they know they're supposed to include, and then examples of what that looks like in practice. And it's really the combination of the two. So things like the moderation materials at Key Stage 2, I find are really good examples of this, where you've got a piece of writing there at a certain standard, that's expected, and then here's one at greater depth. And in both of those different cases, they're annotated with, this is why this meets the standard, and it's quite specific into some of the detail, and then those are things you can teach. So we teach the details, and then we evaluate the quality in a more rounded way. And it's this link of knowing the criteria for standards which informs your teaching. So one of the things that teachers will need to do in any subject that involves writing, which is lots of them, you need to know what the standards are in order to sequence the steps that you go through to meet different ones. So having exemplars and discussions of how you meet those standards in an incremental way is going to be essential. Modelling and scaffolding, Rosenshine talks about. So what are the models? Modelling isn't a thing. Scaffolding isn't a thing in the absence of examples of that in your subject. So scaffolding doesn't exist except through specific resources which you are providing. And these are ones for developing types of writing. And of course, then the scaffolding has to come down. So you then have to get students to learn how to use some of these phrases in their writing by showing them exactly what to do, and then taking the scaffolding away and saying, right, now do it by yourself. And that's a kind of Rosenshine thing. But the curriculum thing is, what are the scaffolds? What are the frames? One of my favourite examples of this, because it's so the GCSE history essay for 8 marks comes along with some pretty bland success criteria in the form of the sort of generic, demonstrates a range of accurate and detailed knowledge and understanding. That doesn't make any sense even to me. I don't know what that would look like unless I see an example. So I want an example. Here's an example. Oh, okay, now, so it's deconstructing the example, tells me how to reach that standard of writing, and I can look at how that's done and then teach it in that way. So curriculum thinking requires you to really break things down from the bigger picture, whether it's the big story of the Tudors or the big story of Hungary and excellent writing, into the steps that to follow. And that's a really core task for a team. So this is the question to think about if you pause this video and look at it. To what extent is your curriculum sequenced in small steps that allow for practice and fluency building? What curriculum elements would you like to explore further to deepen your own knowledge? Because a lot of these things, you actually get better at explaining them the more experienced you are in the subject, even if you've got a degree in it. It's actually the knowledge you need is how to break it down even further still as an expert. And sometimes we can be surprised at how far we have to go because the students don't have the knowledge we have. Rosenshine is brilliant on questioning. So all the questioning techniques, it's this schema building idea again. All the students are learning differently, not entirely differently. I mean, the schools would be a disaster if you couldn't assume that pretty much the children learn in similar ways. You just couldn't have the kids in the same room at all if that wasn't true. But it is true to a degree. But at the same time, they're not identical. And actually, we can't see the variation. We have to find out what the variation is. And so you can't just take one student's answer and say, well, if they know it, pretty much everyone else will. That's often supremely wrong. So you do need to have this range of techniques for involving everybody in your questioning as a sort of first level of formative assessment so that you know whether to go on or not. Rosenshine is clear that effective teachers ask more questions generally than less effective teachers, and significantly they check for understanding. They will do this thing of saying, have you understood? But not in a way which is like literally, have you understood? It's, what have you understood? If you just say, have you understood? You just get a terrible response, which is yes or no. And so there's a repertoire of questioning techniques which I think deal with this issue. Cold calling is one of my favourite ones because it's about making sure that you decide who answers and you involve all your students in thinking about the questions, and this helps them, all be thinking about good answers. Think, pair, share, getting students to talk to each other and disciplining them into doing this well so that they question each other, they practice explaining things, and so on. So this repertoire of questioning techniques, which doesn't come directly from Rosenshine, but it's connected to what he's saying, is the way that you run a room so that you've got everybody thinking about the curriculum content that you're trying to get them to learn. So questioning is an essential part of your thinking about teaching, but also then in curriculum design terms, what are the questions we're asking is a curriculum thinking process. What are the things they should be able to answer? That's the summary there. What have you understood? What sorts of things should they be able to explain? What sort of depth of response are you hoping for when they can say that they've understood? And again, that has a curriculum element to it. And the final thing I want to just talk about is the reviewing material. Sometimes people think Rosenshine is all about quizzing, weirdly, but it just isn't. I mean, it's a part of it. Rosenshine has this observation that teachers who are effective use typically a daily review process of checking prior knowledge, just reflecting back on what we did recently, or checking that students know things before we build on them. So a daily review process has this feeling of activating prior knowledge, getting students to think about what you've done before with a question or a prompt. It could be a quiz, but that's just one way of doing it. And then weekly and monthly review is more about just cycling back, checking that previously taught knowledge is still there, and that could be much more sort of structured in terms of types of questions they're familiar with. Knowing the difference between these, I think, is key. It's really the reason you're doing it, but the nature of the assessment might be the same, but it's not. It's really the difference is minor in a way. I think there are some general principles though. This comes from me rather than Rosenshine, that you do need to involve everyone. So when you're checking prior knowledge, you've got to be checking everybody's prior knowledge, not just asking a couple of kids a few questions. It's questions which everybody has to answer. Everyone can check. you're clear about what the knowledge is. And this is where we come to things like knowledge organisers and so on. If I'm going to do a quiz in a lesson, I don't want to be caught out with some sort of stuff that I had no hope of knowing what was going to be on the quiz. I want to be told that next week we're going to do a quiz on this stuff, this is the stuff, and have a chance to go and study it so that I can do well on that quiz. That's what I want, and so that's what the student should have. So that resource which says this is what you should know needs to be nicely accessible. And of course it could be from some time ago, but I still need to have a sense that I could succeed on any assessment. And so you need to be clear to students. I'm not trying to catch you out. I'm trying to actually help you to do well. And so here's what you should know. And making then students, answer questions from memory, not look them up. So I have seen teachers doing quizzes where the students were just flicking through their book to find the answer. And that isn't really the point, is it? The point is, do I actually know it? And knowing it means without help. Here's an example of a simple idea that you just, what are these tools all for? What are their names? And then everybody write that down. Function and name of these tools. Write it down, everyone's being quizzed, and then boom, here's the answers, and then we have another slide for the functions, and check your own. So getting students to check their own answers and then discussing who got them wrong, I think is really important. So we're not trying to just find out if anybody knew the answers, we're trying to find the opposite. Does anybody not know the answers? And I would have to tell my students in before, I'm expecting you to know all of this. And if they're getting it all right, that's great. And then who still isn't sure? That's the thing I'm really after. So then I can check for the gaps. That schema building is happening everywhere, and I'm finding out where some gaps are. And I'm using this as a formative process of finding out where I still need to support, not just hoping for just a few successes and being happy. It's the absolute opposite of that. And it applies to lots of things like terminology, getting students to practice things, say the words, and there's lots of examples of this I could go into, where the precision that you need to make sure, does every student in my class know the words that I'm teaching them? Can they say them all? That's something which you don't often see. Can every single student say the words they need to use to explain how the breathing apparatus works in the human body? If you're just saying the words and they just only write them down, then that's all they'll learn. A lot of students won't say the words aloud unless you make them, and that's part of the structure of the questioning activities. So you do need to think about how the students engage with the information and the activities they engage with them through, so that they are practicing using that knowledge in lots of different ways, so that they can all use them with some confidence. And that applies to lots of things like quotes. How do I learn a quote? Well, I start with one, and then I learn two, and then I learn three. And how do I learn even one quote? Well, I break it down into pieces and then repeat it several times, and it's the level of frequency and repetition. And I've seen teachers do this superbly well. So it's fun, engaging, lively, the students enjoying it, and through regular exposure to these quotes and using them and applying them, they've developed this incredible knowledge of quotes for using in their essays about Macbeth, which is a great thing to do. But that requires a kind of a routine around that, which you then build into your practice and make it lively and engaging, and the students get better at doing it, because they almost can't escape getting better at doing it, because nearly every week we're running through some of the quotes, and you happen to find full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. Well, I know this because I've said it so often. And that's the sort of thing you need to try to think about. But then you have to be deciding what knowledge that is. You're going back to this, which quotes are they? They can't learn the whole play. So what are the main ones we're going to learn that everyone knows? And that's a curriculum decision. What are the key things we're going to build as sort of really strongly known aspects of the knowledge that they could possibly learn? And that builds into some things like booklets. Here's a knowledge booklet. Here's some questions that link to it. And I've seen these booklets done really well. So extensive curriculum summaries with questions that go with it. The students learn how to answer those questions. And it's linking questions to text. If you just give the text, some students don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to process the information. It's just text. You have to give them questions that they then need to answer in order for them to know the level of depth to go into. And it's the provision of those. In this school, those quizzes are in the booklets that they take home with them. So they learn to answer those questions. And then when they do that quiz in class, they're really expected to get most of it right. And it's a confidence building approach. And there are other ones like this. There's this idea where you tell a story, narrating a whole set of ideas, which you then can verify using some terms. And it's not just a set of individual quiz questions, it's a whole storytelling process. So there's lots of types of retrieval practice, not just one. It's important to understand that Rosenshine isn't saying everyone should do a quiz at the start of each lesson. He's basically saying that you do daily review, weekly and monthly review. The nature of that review is there's a huge range of approaches, and it's really important to have an expansive view of the way retrieval practice needs to take form in a class, so that the schema building has this richness and variety to it. This is the question to ask yourself. you'll already be doing retrieval practice, but how could you adapt it? How could you strengthen it so that even more students retain even more knowledge? That's the goal. It's not about doing it or not doing it. It's about doing it so that you're getting even more out of it. So there we go. That's the last thing. Rosenshine's principles are there to be reviewed in any way you like, and I don't think it's about doing them or not. It's all about the quality of what you do and the frequency, the intensity, and it's certainly the way it links to curriculum design is part of that. So I hope that's been a useful run through, and now I'll be ready to take your questions. Thank you.
Welcome back. Fascinating. A lot of the things you'll be familiar with that was discussed there, but to actually see them in context and all unified together in terms of an approach. For those of you that haven't read and looked at Rosenshine's principles, definitely recommend that you go away and do that. For those of you that have, it's just nice seeing how it links together with the curriculums that we work with. So what I'd like to do now is welcome Tom to the stage, to the E stage. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tom.
Hello, good. No, it's a pleasure. It's quite weird watching myself speaking, but anyway.
I'm sure it's not.
Thanks to everybody joining. There's 400 people here. It's extraordinary.
Absolutely. I think we jumped up to about 430, I think, at one point. So really, really great audience, a really varied mix. I don't know if you saw the comments at the beginning where people were saying where they were from. And
I was from Japan. Hello, Japan. Fantastic.
I think we've got Claire from Casablanca, who messaged earlier. I think we've got a huge range from all over. So I think the principles that you discussed there within the education sector, no matter where you are, I think they apply. Students in general are students, and education in terms of what we need them to do applies no matter where you are. So I think it's a very wide audience there. I think we're going to hook straight into the question. There's been some fascinating questions that have come up. Where did you want to start, Tom?
Well, I've written a few down. So should I just go through the ones that I've got?
Absolutely.
So there's a question about the difference between daily review and weekly and monthly review, and I sort of talked about that later on, but I think it's important to for me, I think it's useful to see those having slightly different functions. So the purpose of a daily review is really to do what Rosenshine talks about, being activating prior knowledge. So, and you can do that in lots of ways, and the reason you do that is because you've got lots of things in your long-term memory, and the students have, but in order to build on that, you need to build it forward into your working memory so you can start to manipulate that. So you need to give people, so for example, an obvious one would be in a maths lesson, you just show them a question like the ones they did before to say, like, have a go at this. And so everyone's doing a question like one they've done before, and that's activating their recall of how to do it. And that's as simple as that. And now now they've engaged their brain with that stuff. Now you're ready to sort of push on. It could be a quiz, but it doesn't really have to be. It could be as simple as, okay, turn to your partner and imagine you were going to explain to them as if they were, say, in the year below, the key idea about X that we talked about last week. Go. And so they're now having to explain something, and that's forcing them to engage with their prior knowledge. And that is a good type of daily review, because you're thinking. You don't even have to check all of their content. You're just getting them to think, and that's the goal. Whereas the weekly and monthly review is a bit more strategic. It's a bit more precise about, we need to make sure everyone knows the things they should know. And so there you're more likely to be doing a more strategic scan of the most recent learning, or going back a month and feeding in selected ideas so that you're checking everyone's got it. And that's where things like knowledge organizers and like resources that the students have, which tell them what they're supposed to know. I'm a firm believer that the students need to be empowered to succeed. And it's not about trying to just chuck a load of questions at them like a quiz in a pub where you don't have the remotest idea what's going to come up. It should be like, here's all the stuff you should know. Do you know it? That's how it should feel. And so they have the sense of being able to get it all right if they've done their work, if they've studied. So I think that's the difference. And quizzing, a routine habit. Some head teachers I know are quite keen on this idea that making it an absolute routine helps, because it's expected. Every day we start with a quiz. And I get that routine. My only worry about that is that I think every time we're doing these activities, we should be thinking, am I training my students to study? So am I training them to do this for themselves? Because that's where real learning happens. It's when you're thinking yourself, do I know it? What do I need to do better? And if your experience of having a knowledge checked is that someone asks you questions, you're not really necessarily training yourself to do it yourself. So I think we need to be making sure that some of our things that we do involve the students checking their own knowledge or checking each other's as part of the diet. And that gets them into the habit of asking good questions, checking answers, and engaging with the very real thing of the degree of success. Like, how do I know I'm right? And sometimes that's a discussion. Is this a good enough answer? Well, and somebody asked me this question further down. They said, how do we check everyone's answers in a quiz? How do I know everyone's right? Well, that's another reason why you need to empower students, because you can't check everybody's answers every minute. It's just not feasible. But you can train students to do it. So it's the simplest thing is, here's a question, here's an answer. Who got it wrong? And I do think this is a really key thing to get established in the classroom, is that fessing up when you're wrong is totally normal. And my normal way into doing that is to always focus on the kids who get things like 8 out of 10, because they've got 2 wrong. And they're normally thrilled to tell you they got 8 out of 10. And so they're quite happy to say which ones they got wrong. And so you say, well, that's interesting. What did you put instead of that? Oh, well, why do you think you made that mistake? And you start talking about wrongness. And then if that's happening, you can start saying, well, who wasn't sure about number 6? Yeah, what did you put? Okay, so do you understand why that's now wrong? And we're talking about wrong answers. And that's how you do it. You don't just go, what did you get? What did you get? What did you get? It's just, that's not possible. So in a dynamic, formative way, flushing out error is key. I have to say, I don't often see that. Most of the time, teachers say things like, who got number 1 right? Oh, well done, brilliant. What did you put for number 2? Brilliant, that's good, well done. And it's like all affirming the rightness. And you've got students, they're cringing, thinking, bloody hell, everyone seems to know it, and I don't. And they're not only are they not volunteering their answers, they're the opposite. They're pretending they didn't get it wrong. And you've got to make sure that's not happening in your lessons, that kids are pretending to know things they don't know. So I think that's the key. Focus on the wrong answers more than the right ones. And then you're training students to be honest with themselves. One teacher I worked with last year told me a big revelation to him was, he was doing this daily quizzing and the students were all checking their answers. And then he was a bit gutted by the tests, like in the sort of half-termly tests. They seemed to know less than they were showing in the lesson. And one of his students gave him a bit of an insight through when they were looking at the self-checking, that they were kind of being a bit too generous with themselves. So a simple swap of like checking your partner's answers, suddenly their scores on their daily quizzes plummeted because they were being more honest. Like they were getting 3 out of 10 instead of 7 out of 10. And so he realized, with that particular class, I do need to swap to check, because then I'm going to get a more accurate sort of sense of what they know and don't know. And that type of thing is so simple, but it makes a difference. And you've got to work out with your class how to do all those things. So someone asked me, how do you incorporate formative assessment with Rosenshine's principles? Well, I think he doesn't use the terminology, but I think it's implicit in things like check for understanding. That is what formative assessment is. And significantly, check for understanding is getting students to tell you what they know. It's not asking them if they know. You're saying, what did you understand? What did you understand? And a quiz is a form of formative assessment if you're doing that. But questioning is the first layer of formative assessment, checking that students understand, getting students to tell each other. And I do think, and I find myself saying this a lot, because it's very common for a teacher to solicit 3 or 4 responses and sort of think that'll do. But then there are students sitting in the class who haven't really aired their thoughts at all. So they kind of they're not even sure if they know, never mind the teacher knowing that, because they haven't a chance to verbalize or articulate their thinking. So using pairs, talk to your partner and explain, is a really important formative process, because it gives the students a chance to say what they think. And to verify against the kind of the shared discussion that's in the class. But if they've never even said it out loud, there's always a sense that they haven't quite tested themselves. So mixing good class interaction with paired discussion is useful.
Just while you're looking for the next question, I'm just going to remind people that at Chiltern TSA on Twitter, discussion is live And I'm just looking at the feed now, and lots of points to discuss there. So if you are on Twitter as well, do share your thoughts on today's session. Just so you know, Tom Sherrington, if you're not following him, his Twitter handle is teacherhead, at teacherhead, and have a look at there, at Chiltern TSA, and just post your comments and your thoughts on today's sessions. We are looking through those, and we have got another Twitter takeover from another one of our colleagues. So do go on there and have a look. Okay, Tom, back to you.
Yeah, and I would say that I just, by the way, I know that Arv will probably tell you this later, but I sent a link to the slides. So the slides, you'll get it. I don't know how you'll get this, but you can sort of just access them and revisit them, as well as the video, but the actual slides. So somebody said, if you're doing some modeling, like modeling strategies in a training, where would you begin? And I think that's a great question, because I actually think that because you can obviously do this for yourself, but if you're someone listening to this who's going to be going to do it, feed into a training with other people, modeling how these things work is so key. I would always start with, anything you're doing is to show how it works. And I think counter examples are really, really helpful. So as well as showing them what to do, sort of show why it doesn't work to do certain other things. And I would always start with something like questioning techniques, like cold calling and checking for understanding, so that you model how do I in this room of people. So set people a real question. That's how I normally do. So get people to think about an actual question. It could be a maths question or a bit of history knowledge or something. Get them literally discussing it. And people who've been on any of my training, they know I always ask people to explain why the sun rises in the east. And boy, that's funny, because people think the sun rises in the east every single day, and yet when you have to explain it, you think, oh, can I explain it? And you're modeling the fact that something you think actually requires quite a lot of effort to put into a kind of a linear set of bullet points or ideas. And then you do the thing so you're modeling the pair. So in your pair discuss, so you're modeling that. And then you model cold calling by choosing which groups to answer. So you don't get people to just call out. You say, right, well, guys, what were you saying? And you model that. You model that exact thing of, what were you saying? You don't say, right, what's your answer? You're asking them to reflect their discussion. That invitation to say, because then people will say things like, well, gosh, we weren't really sure, but what we think is, and this tentative way of responding, I think is really, really important. People need to feel that it's okay to be unsure, and that's part of the teaching process. So you model that in the way you ask the question to the group, and then you get them to explain their full answer. So that you're modeling that. And then what you do is you model the check for understanding. So you've heard a group explain why the sun rises in the east, and then you turn to another group and you say, okay, so let's hear what you think. What do you think they were saying? So they've had to listen. And then, right, what do you think they were saying? And that's really interesting. So you're modeling, that's what you do in a lesson. You don't just say, tell me what you think. You're saying, tell me what you think they were saying, which is checking their understanding, but it's also an accountability about listening to others. And all these things are things you do in a lesson, but you model it with the adults in a training. And that to me, I tell you, one of the things I always do in a training is I'm very bossy about the pairs, because you're modeling. I'm not just going to say to you around your table of 6, have a discussion about X, because even with adults, if you do that, what happens is pontificator guy takes over the table, and people sort of just like crushed by the weight of this person's assertiveness, and sit there listening to the guy talk for the whole time. So you have to say that's going to happen. So you have to say, no, I want you to, in your table, who's your partner? And you're doing this with the adults. I always say, I don't want you talking across the whole table, because then some people won't get a chance to speak. So even that type of thing you do in a lesson, do it with the group. So there's so many aspects of modeling that you can do. Show them a quiz, show them how to do it, to answer it, to check their answers, and model how you would run a quiz, because then, and maybe I model how not to. So what I found is very useful is that people think they're doing a quiz. But I mean, I've literally seen teachers teach a quiz where they have asked one student one question at a time. And you think, it's so weird. They've gone through 10 questions and 10 people answered one question each. And you think, well, can you see why that's not very effective? But you almost like it's unbelievable that someone would do that, but they're not really thinking. They just think, oh God, it's so obvious. Of course, I haven't even asked everybody to answer all the questions. I've wasted all those questions. And as showing that why that's not effective is prompts people to change their thinking, maybe. Somebody asked me about this virtual school. How can you do how do you get a question and answer going in a virtual school, checking for understanding? Well, it obviously depends exactly what that means. So if it's dynamic, I was talking to a friend yesterday whose kid is at school, and it is a school where they all have laptops, to be honest, and they literally are asked questions. They're on sound only, but they can't even go to the loo during a lesson because they might be asked a question live in the lesson, which is pretty intense. But I think that's on the fringes of what's generally people mean. If it's sort of video presentation and the students just have to respond online, offline in their own time, you do need to. There's a bit of a responsibility on the students here. One of the things I would do is explicitly talk to them about generative learning. So the thing of checking your own knowledge. So teaching them to check their own knowledge generatively. Because if you don't make a thing of that, students will very, very commonly excessively rely on just rereading their notes and thinking they're covering stuff by going over it, by flicking through it. And they'll always sort of cheat themselves through this illusion of familiarity. So you've got to talk explicitly to them about the discipline of turning over the knowledge organizer, closing the book, and answering the questions without any help at all, and then going back to check if they were right. And of course, you can't verify that in live, but you can verify it later when they do an assessment. So you can sort of say, we're going to do an assessment on this later, and you're going to need to know this stuff. And so therefore, make sure you can do it without help. And it's giving them a goal to work towards. Like, here's a specific set of knowledge you should know, and check if you know it without help. And making that really explicit. Of course, some students still won't do that, but that's part of the challenge we're dealing with. And the ones who are more motivated to really check their knowledge themselves will do it, and others won't. And that's going to be one of the issues we have. But I do think that you have to be explicit about the process. How do I know if I'm right? Well, you need to have a way of checking your answers. And why is it a problem if I just keep looking them up? Because you just don't know if you know it or not. And it's just not accurate enough. So I would that's the only suggestion I can really think of, because if you can't ask a question dynamically, you have to rely on the students to sort of do that themselves.
I'm just going to hook straight into that. You've kind of answered and you've discussed this in terms of focusing on the wrong answers and empowering students to do some self-evaluation and self-checking of the work that they've done and their understanding. Rachel asked a question about how do you get your students to that point? So what do you think would be the key things that you need to introduce in your practice as a teacher, that you can start instilling that type of confidence in students that it's okay to actually get things wrong, admit it, and then open up that discussion?
I just think you need to do it just from the very beginning. So I see this all the time with teachers. They're not even really aware of doing it. They're so and I mean, every time I say this about teachers, I'm talking about stuff I've done myself. Like, people are almost so grateful that somebody knows something, they over lavish the praise on that person, which makes the people who didn't know it slightly like, yikes, So be kind of cooler about people who are right. And it's really, and I don't really mean that. So yeah, that's good. Well done. So who wasn't sure? Like, almost quickly. Yeah, because I wasn't sure about what did you get? Okay. Yeah. So, and pick, initially maybe pick on people who are like slightly more confident. So again, I've said this before, but if you do any kind of knowledge check, which is like a 5 questions and who got 4 out of 5, brilliant. Which one did you get wrong? I'm really interested. Oh, really? Okay. Do you want to tell us what you put? And right from the beginning, you make it normal, and there's nothing bad happens.
Yeah.
If you pick on the kid who got not wrong, they're feeling terrible. I mean, it's probably not the place to start. But even if the slightly less confident kids can see that the other kids are quite open about their wrongness, then it's more natural. But you have to make it the absolute norm. That's almost the purpose of every quiz, is to find out what we don't know.
Yeah.
And not to boast about what we do know. It's like, we're still not there yet. Okay, let's see if we can. Why? Or sometimes you can reverse it. You can say things like, to depersonalize it, what might somebody put? What might be a typical wrong answer? And you get students to do that. Or here's a question. Can you see what mistake so and so made? Can you spot the error? It's like all that kind of error spotting is really, really key. I noticed a question someone put earlier, which I'm sorry, I was going to dive in there, is someone was saying, when you're doing daily review, does it have to be, how far back can you go? Is it okay to jump back? And I think this is a really interesting sort of decision. Of course, you've got, what you don't want to do is make every time you do a daily review, it sort of expand into taking up a big chunk of the time so that you've got less time to teach new material. Unless that daily review is part of that new material, so that the consolidation of practice then builds straight in. And I think that's a really sort of useful thing. If it's a review of previous material, I think, and it's sort of totally separate from your sort of current lesson, that's perfectly fine. But I think that's where that sort of strategic approach comes in. And my personal preference is for that to have a slightly different rhythm to it, so that you might have like a weekly check of prior knowledge, and that's kind of the routine. Every week we'll do a kind of monthly review or whatever, and that's more that type of question. Whereas the daily review is a bit more organic and more likely to lead on today's knowledge checking. But here's the other thing I was going to say is that if the knowledge you're checking is like literally totally separate from the topic now, that can be useful, but it's really, really great if you can make connections with it. So you'll sort of, and it could be anything, and it depends what your subject is, but if the check is, say, in a languages lesson, there's a whole set of structures that you did a month ago. How do you feed those into your current work is a really powerful thing. Or in a science lesson, you did what seems like a totally separate topic, and the questions are, what's similar about that? Remember we talked about energy in that situation? Well, how does that apply in this situation? And we're sort of making links with prior topics, even though they seem to be separate. So that's the sort of thing I'd encourage. The more the prior learning and the practice is folded into the new topic, the more integrated all the knowledge becomes. And actually, there's a really good section on this if you read Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? He has a whole chapter on drill. Is drill a good idea? And that's what they call it in the US, like practice. And he's saying that it is a good idea. But the truth is, you just don't have time to drill everything there is in the curriculum. You just don't. So he's saying, you have to think, well, what are the things that I really need the students to know really, really fluently in order to build other things on it, and focus your practice, your high frequency drills on those things. And there are other things you just have to not do the same with, because you just haven't got the time to. So there are things like certain structures in languages, whatever, which you use them so often, it's much more better to practice using those than all the slightly harder ones, which are more rare, because you want to build fluency with certain things. And some operations in maths, like simple operations like adding, multiplying, dividing, and knowing number bonds, those sorts of things. So many things build on that it's really quite fruitful to practice a lot of those things, not just keep practicing, try to practice absolutely everything, because you just can't, you haven't got time. So be selective about the things you're focusing on for your regular retrieval practice. And because otherwise you'll find that, people often have this dilemma, how can I keep going back if I've still got to keep going forward?
Yeah.
Well, that's by choosing. You have to choose. And that you can't do everything. So you've got to take the pressure off yourself to think, I've got to teach everything sort of several times over. Okay. How are we doing for time?
Right. I was going to say, we've probably got time for one quick question, and then we can wrap up the session, if that's okay with you.
I'm just going to go for this last one here. This is, what is your opinion on getting students to do 5 a day in every lesson, every subject, every day? Students have to write 5 sentences at the beginning of every single lesson for all lessons that day. Is this effective? I'm going to say, I don't particularly think that's a great idea, to have an absolute rigid routine. Apart from anything else, not every subject needs that approach. So there are some, like, it depends how literally you mean, but there's some practical subjects, for example, where the most precious time they got is just getting on with the practical work. And if they have to do the quiz that everyone else is doing because it's the mandated thing, I just think that's starting to get bizarre. But also, you just need variety. Retrieval, the way that I've just talked about, I don't know, what did I talk about earlier? Henry VIII's wives, or knowing how the sun rises in the east. Now, the way to really know that is to be one day quizzed on some facts, the next time explain it to my friend, the next time write some sentences, the next time respond to some multiple choice questions, which are checking, really sort of, is it this or this or this, which is the best answer. So I'm going to understand that more successfully over time if I'm asked about that knowledge in different ways. So if there's a standard routine to absolutely every way, you're just not going to get that variety. So I'd say the routine should be some form of retrieval every day. Why not? I mean, that's probably a really good idea. But I would also be saying have a repertoire. So it doesn't mean like it's absolutely anything. You could just have even 3 things, like a quiz, a talk to your partner, and writing a mind map or something. And we train the students to do the 3 things we usually do, or the 5 things. And today it's turn to your partner, and they know what that means, so they do that. And you just train them in the small set of strategies they regularly use, and you're just going to select which one you're going to do on a given day. That, at very least, gives a bit of variety and also some routine, and you get the best of both worlds.
Yeah. And I think definitely having the variety helps embed that knowledge that they need to retain over a period of time. So I think definitely having a range of strategies and having different inputs, different ways of receiving that information, definitely helps the students to remember more of what they've learned over time, which is what we're trying to do, I think. So I think that's a brilliant way to actually end the session. I know there's lots of questions on there, Tom, already, but I think we've covered quite a lot of the key topics. So first of all, I want to thank you, Tom. Immense amount of effort and the resources that you can share and the time you've given today, hugely valued by us and I think by the attendees as well, by looking at some of the comments on there. So thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you for inviting me. And I know that the video, when it goes on YouTube, will be pristine quality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As always,
Yeah.
That will be. So again, thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you for inviting me.
No, it's been a privilege. Thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of another session. Fantastic session. And again, a lot to take away from that. The conversation is continuing on Twitter at Chiltern TSA. Do go on there and follow it. Tom is at Teacherhead. So have a look at his posts and the other things that he actually collaborates with and works with as well. There's lots and lots to have a look at. Variety of books that he's published as well. Have a look and see if you haven't read any of those. I'd recommend highly that you go on there, get them down onto your Kindle if you've got one. So from that point of view, lots to move on with. Just want to quickly share with you what we've got coming up for the rest of the week. Vic Goddard tomorrow, looking at difficult conversations. Had a fascinating conversation with him yesterday afternoon about what he's going through and what their school's going through, and many schools are going through at the moment. But in terms of difficult conversations and managing difficult conversations. And then we've got the wonderful Bob Cox on Thursday, looking at a new vision for challenging English. And then on Friday, we have Tom Rees, who'll be looking at leadership and how to prepare for headship. That's hashtag LDeduchat for another day. We look forward to seeing you at some of our future sessions. I hope you enjoyed today. This is me, Arv Kaushal, signing off for another session of hashtag LDeduchat, Leadership Development in Education Online. Thank you.